I have studied the collapse of military powers before. Rome fell not when barbarian armies breached their walls, but when the empire could no longer produce the weapons needed to defend itself without depending on the very peoples they sought to control. The Byzantine Empire crumbled not from foreign invasion, but from dependency on others for the materials essential to their military superiority. The Ottoman military machines stagnated when they became reliant on European suppliers for the gunpowder and steel that had once made them invincible. Each collapse followed the same pattern. The established military power assumed that their technological superiority was permanent, that their control over strategic resources was unshakable, that their suppliers would remain subordinate indefinitely. They built entire defense establishments around materials and technologies that seemed secure, never considering that dependency relationships could reverse or that suppliers could become controllers. Now I witness another empire discovering that its military dominance depends entirely on the goodwill of a neighbor it once took for granted. The public believes this is a story about mining and geology. They see news reports about lithium deposits and battery technology. They read headlines about critical minerals and supply chain diversification. They do not recognize what I recognize: the complete subjugation of American military power to Canadian resource control, executed through a geological accident that has transformed the balance of strategic leverage for the next century. The Pentagon understands what the public does not. Deep beneath the frozen wilderness of northern Quebec lies the largest concentration of critical minerals ever discovered on Earth. 15 million tons of lithium carbonate equivalent, representing 40% of current global proven reserves. Massive deposits of neodymium and dysprosium, rare earth elements that are absolutely essential for the permanent magnets and missile guidance systems, radar arrays, and electronic warfare equipment. Cobalt concentrations that exceed the combined reserves of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Australia. Graphite deposits of exceptional purity required for the neutron moderators in naval reactors and the heat shields on hypersonic weapons. But the numbers alone do not capture the strategic catastrophe this represents for American military planning. Every F-35 fighter aircraft requires approximately 920 pounds of rare earth elements for its radar, electronic warfare systems, and flight control computers. Each Aegis missile defense system contains over 2 tons of rare earth materials in its phased array radar systems. A single Virginia-class nuclear submarine requires more than 9,000 pounds of rare earth elements for its sonar, navigation, and weapon systems. The James Bay Formation contains sufficient quantities of these materials to supply American defense needs for over 2 centuries. But they lie entirely within Canadian territory, subject to Canadian law, Canadian environmental regulations, and Canadian political decisions. For the first time since the founding of the Republic, the United States cannot produce a single advanced weapon system without materials controlled by a foreign government. Not a fighter jet, not a guided missile, not an electronic warfare system, not a satellite, nothing. This is not resource scarcity. This is resource monopolization by a power that American strategists never considered a potential controller of strategic leverage. Canada controls 40% of global lithium reserves through the James Bay Formation. Canada controls the specialized processing infrastructure necessary to transform raw materials into components suitable for military applications. Canada controls the transportation networks and logistics systems that move these materials to global markets. Most critically, Canada has refused to guarantee unconditional access to these materials, regardless of diplomatic disagreements or policy disputes. For the first time in American history, military production depends on maintaining good relations with a country that has its own interests, its own foreign policy priorities, and its own agenda that may not always align with American strategic objectives. The implications became clear in classified Pentagon briefings conducted throughout 2024 and early 2025. Defense planners realized that every major weapon system, from the F-35 fighter to the Patriot missile system, required materials that Canada could restrict or cut off entirely if relations deteriorated: the rare earth elements in radar systems, the lithium in satellite power systems, the graphite in missile guidance computers, all controlled by Canadian companies operating under Canadian law. This dependency extends beyond raw materials to encompass the entire technology supply chain that enables American military superiority. The semiconductors that control precision weapons require rare earth elements from James Bay. The battery systems that power unmanned vehicles require lithium from Canadian mines. The electronic components that enable secure military communications require materials that Canada can restrict at will. American defense contractors discovered that their multi-billion-dollar production lines were vulnerable to disruption by mining decisions made in Quebec boardrooms. Lockheed Martin's F-35 program depends on Canadian materials for its avionics systems. Raytheon's missile production requires Canadian rare earth elements for guidance systems. General Dynamics' electronic warfare capabilities depend on Canadian graphite for signal processing components. The Pentagon's response revealed the depth of American strategic desperation. the complete abandonment of principles that had guided American defense policy for over 7 decades. For the first time in history, the Defense Production Act was extended to include foreign companies operating on foreign soil under foreign jurisdiction. Canadian mining companies extracting James Bay materials suddenly found themselves eligible for American defense spending, American technology transfers, and American strategic partnerships that had previously been reserved exclusively for domestic suppliers operating under direct Pentagon oversight. This represented more than a policy adjustment. This was a fundamental abandonment of American strategic independence that violated every principle the Defense Production Act was created to uphold. The act was established during World War II specifically to ensure that critical war materials could be produced domestically without foreign interference, foreign delays, or foreign policy complications. President Harry Truman signed the legislation with the explicit understanding that American military power should never depend on the cooperation of foreign governments, regardless of how friendly those governments might appear. The extension to Canadian companies acknowledged that American military production now depended on foreign cooperation to such an extent that traditional concepts of strategic autonomy had become not just obsolete, but operationally impossible. Pentagon planners faced a choice between maintaining theoretical independence while accepting practical impotence, or banding independence while securing access to the materials that modern military systems require. They chose dependence. But this dependence came with conditions that revealed how completely the strategic balance had shifted from American dominance to Canadian control. The arrangement required Canadian companies to prioritize American military needs during national emergencies, but this priority came with a price that revealed how completely the strategic balance had shifted. Canadian companies demanded technology transfers that gave them access to American military technologies that had been classified at the highest levels for decades. They required American defense contractors to establish Canadian facilities that employed Canadian workers, contributed to Canadian economic development, and operated under Canadian labor and environmental laws that were often more restrictive than American equivalents. Most significantly, they insisted on partnerships rather than supplier relationships. Instead of simply selling raw materials to American manufacturers according to traditional commercial arrangements, Canadian companies became integral partners in American defense production with access to classified technologies. Substantial influence over weapon system development and the ability to affect production schedules based on Canadian policy priorities rather than American military needs. Lockheed Martin's partnership with Canadian mining firm Lithium Americas exemplifies the new power dynamic. Instead of purchasing lithium through traditional commodity markets, Lockheed committed to establishing its primary F-35 component manufacturing facility in Quebec, directly adjacent to James Bay extraction operations. This arrangement provides Lockheed with priority access to lithium for aircraft batteries and electronic systems, but it also gives Canadian partners access to F-35 manufacturing technologies and the ability to influence production decisions that affect American military readiness. The deal requires Lockheed to share advanced materials processing techniques with Canadian partners, establishing joint research and development programs that give Canadian companies access to military technologies that had been exclusively American for over 50 years. Canadian engineers now work alongside American military contractors on classified defense projects, not as subordinate suppliers, but as equal partners with access to information that could affect American strategic planning. Raytheon's partnership with Canadian rare earth processor Northern Minerals represents an even more dramatic surrender of American technological independence. The company committed to relocating its primary missile guidance system production from Arizona to Quebec, making American missile capabilities dependent on Canadian factory operations managed by Canadian workers operating under Canadian government oversight. This arrangement provides Raytheon with access to the high-purity rare earth elements required for precision guidance systems, but it also gives Canadian partners access to missile technology that forms the foundation of American strategic nuclear capabilities. The Patriot missile systems that defend American bases and allied nations are now produced through facilities that could be affected by Canadian labor disputes, Canadian environmental regulations, or Canadian foreign policy disagreements with American military operations. The psychological impact on American military leadership was profound and created tensions that continue to reverberate through Pentagon planning processes. Officers who had built entire careers on the assumption of American strategic independence found themselves managing supply chains that depended on the cooperation of a foreign government whose interests might not align with American strategic objectives. Planning exercises that had always assumed unlimited access to necessary materials now included scenarios where Canadian policy disagreements could cripple American military readiness within months rather than years. Joint Chiefs of Staff meetings began, including briefings on Canadian domestic politics, Canadian environmental regulations, and Canadian foreign policy positions that had never been considered relevant to American military planning. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin reportedly ordered a comprehensive review of weapon systems that could be affected by Canadian supply chain disruptions. And the classified results of that review indicated that virtually every major American military capability had become vulnerable to Canadian policy decisions. The most disturbing aspect for military leaders was the speed with which this vulnerability had developed. As recently as 2022, American defense planners had operated under the assumption that critical mineral supply chains were manageable through strategic stockpiling, alternative suppliers, and emergency procurement procedures during wartime. The scale of the James Bay discovery made all of these traditional approaches inadequate overnight. Strategic stockpiling became meaningless when Canada controlled such massive reserves that alternative sources were economically unviable and politically unreliable. Emergency procurement became impossible when Canada controlled not just raw materials, but also the specialized processing facilities necessary to transform raw materials into components suitable for military applications. Alternative suppliers became irrelevant when Canadian reserves dwarfed all other known deposits combined and offered cost advantages that no competitor could match. The transformation affected every level of military planning and created vulnerabilities that had never existed in American strategic history. Strategic nuclear forces depended on Canadian materials for missile guidance systems and satellite communications. Conventional forces required Canadian resources for armored vehicles, aircraft systems, and advanced electronics. Electronic warfare capabilities relied on Canadian rare earth elements for jamming equipment, radar systems, and secure communications equipment. Even basic military logistics depended on Canadian components for transportation systems, supply chain management, and battlefield coordination systems. This dependency created new vulnerabilities that American adversaries recognized immediately and began exploiting through sophisticated intelligence operations. Chinese strategic analysts began studying Canadian political dynamics, Canadian environmental movements, and Canadian Indigenous rights issues. Understanding that influence over Canadian resource decisions could indirectly affect American military capabilities more effectively than traditional espionage efforts against American defense installations. Russian intelligence services expanded their operations in Canada, recognizing that disrupting Canadian mining operations could impact American defense readiness more effectively than traditional espionage or sabotage efforts against American facilities. The most devastating aspect was the speed with which this dependency had developed. As recently as 2023, American defense planners had assumed that critical mineral supply chains could be managed through stockpiling, alternative suppliers, and emergency procurement procedures. The James Bay discovery changed these calculations overnight by concentrating so much essential material in a single geological formation controlled by a single government. Stockpiling became inadequate when Canada controlled such massive reserves that alternative sources were economically unviable. Emergency procurement became impossible when Canada controlled the processing facilities necessary to transform raw materials into usable components. Alternative suppliers became irrelevant when Canadian reserves dwarfed all other known deposits combined. American technology companies faced the same strategic reality. Tesla's electric vehicle production required Canadian lithium for battery systems. Apple's electronics manufacturing needed Canadian rare earth elements for components. Microsoft's data center operations depended on Canadian materials for server hardware. Google's satellite internet systems required Canadian resources for power and communications equipment. These companies discovered that their technological competitiveness depended not on American innovation or American investment, but on maintaining good relationships with Canadian resource controllers. Market capitalization that had been built on assumptions of secure supply chains suddenly became vulnerable to decisions made in Ottawa and Quebec City. The competitive implications extended beyond individual companies to encompass entire technological sectors where American leadership had been taken for granted. Electric vehicle development, renewable energy systems, advanced electronics, space technology, all depended on materials that Canada could restrict or redirect to other customers if American companies failed to offer sufficiently attractive partnerships. Chinese companies, recognizing this strategic opportunity, began offering Canadian mining firms partnerships that provided access to Asian markets without the regulatory complications and political pressures associated with American customers. European companies offered technology transfers and joint research programs that gave Canadian firms access to advanced manufacturing techniques and product development capabilities. This international competition for Canadian cooperation forced American companies to offer increasingly generous terms for access to James Bay materials. Instead of the traditional model where American companies negotiated from positions of strength with resource suppliers, Canadian companies found themselves courted by multiple American firms, offering technology transfers, facility investments, and partnership agreements that provided substantial benefits to Canadian operations. The most sophisticated American response came from companies that recognized the new strategic reality and adapted their business models accordingly. Instead of simply purchasing Canadian materials, they established integrated partnerships that made their success dependent on Canadian success. Tesla committed to building its primary North American battery manufacturing facilities in Canada, ensuring that Canadian materials would be processed by Canadian workers using technologies developed through Canadian-American cooperation. This approach provided Tesla with secure access to essential materials while giving Canada substantial influence over one of the world's most valuable technology companies. The arrangement benefited both parties, but it also acknowledged that American technological leadership now required Canadian partnership rather than American dominance. Defense contractors adopted similar strategies, establishing Canadian subsidiaries and research facilities that gave them access to Canadian materials while providing Canada with technological capabilities and manufacturing expertise that had previously been concentrated in American facilities. Lockheed Martin's Canadian operations became integral to F-35 production, handling components that required direct access to James Bay materials. These partnerships represented more than business arrangements. They constituted a fundamental restructuring of the American military-industrial complex to accommodate Canadian strategic interests and Canadian policy priorities. American defense contractors found themselves bound by Canadian labor laws, Canadian environmental regulations, and Canadian foreign policy positions that might conflict with American strategic objectives. The implications for American military planning were unprecedented. Weapon systems designed and built through Canadian partnerships could not be used against countries that Canada opposed without risking the interruption of essential supply chains. Military operations that Canada disapproved of could face equipment shortages or maintenance difficulties if Canadian companies restricted access to critical components. This gave Canada indirect influence over American military policy that extended far beyond traditional diplomatic channels. Canadian resource decisions could affect American military readiness more directly than most formal alliance commitments, creating a new form of strategic leverage that had no precedent in modern international relations. The historical parallel reveals the magnitude of this transformation and its inevitable consequences. When Rome became dependent on barbarian tribes for military recruitment, the empire's strategic autonomy began dissolving. The barbarian federati who fought for Rome initially seemed like solutions to manpower shortages, but they eventually realized they possessed the power to dictate terms to the empire they supposedly served. Canada's control over American military supply chains follows the same logical progression. What began as American efforts to reduce dependence on Chinese suppliers has evolved into dependence on Canadian suppliers who possess even greater leverage because they control larger resource concentrations and operate from more secure political positions. The difference is that Canada has no intention of destroying American military capabilities. Canadian strategic interests align with maintaining strong American defense capabilities that contribute to mutual security and democratic governance. But Canadian cooperation comes with conditions that acknowledge Canada's sovereign control over strategic resources and Canada's right to pursue independent policies that may not always align with American preferences. This conditionality represents a fundamental challenge to American assumptions about alliance relationships and strategic partnerships. For decades, American policy assumed that allied nations would ultimately defer to American leadership on critical security issues because they depended on American protection and economic leadership. The James Bay discovery reverses this dependency relationship. American defense capabilities now depend on Canadian cooperation, to such an extent that American strategic planning must accommodate Canadian interests, even when those interests conflict with American preferences. The long-term implications extend beyond immediate military concerns to encompass fundamental questions about American strategic independence and the sustainability of American global leadership. Military powers that depend on foreign suppliers for essential materials find their strategic options constrained by the need to maintain good relations with those suppliers. Canada's commitment to multilateral institutions, environmental protection, and diplomatic solutions creates potential areas of disagreement with American approaches that have historically relied more heavily on military pressure and economic coercion. The ultimate irony is that American efforts to achieve strategic independence from Chinese control have resulted in strategic dependence on Canadian control that is potentially more constraining. Chinese restrictions on material exports could be overcome through alternative suppliers or emergency stockpiling. Canadian restrictions on integrated supply chains would require rebuilding entire manufacturing systems and technological capabilities that have taken decades to develop. The age of American military independence has ended. The Pentagon now plans operations, designs weapons, and manages global security commitments with the understanding that their capabilities depend on maintaining good relations with a neighboring country that has its own interests and agenda. Most people do not yet understand what has occurred, but the classified briefings continue in Pentagon conference rooms. The emergency meetings persist in defense contractor boardrooms. The diplomatic missions to Ottawa multiply as American officials seek assurances that Canadian cooperation will continue. The fundamental reality has already changed. American military supremacy now depends on Canadian permission. This is how empires discover their limitations, not through dramatic defeats or sudden collapses, but through the gradual realization that their power depends on others who may not share their ambitions or support their methods.